Bite the Bullet was not just Richard Brooks's most personal Western. It was a $4 million love poem to a dying America that opened on the same weekend as Jaws and was eaten alive, leaving behind a film whose cast included a real-world champion rodeo cowboy playing a fictional dying cowboy, an actress who needed to be dressed down by Gene Hackman before she understood what acting actually was, and a supporting character whose entire function in the story was reconstructed through a single looped line of dialogue after the actor playing him suffered a heart attack in the New Mexico desert. We are digging into the wreckage of Bite the Bullet with 12 secrets the studio tried to bury. Secrets locked inside production reports, casting correspondence, period interviews, and the kind of Hollywood career archaeology that only makes sense once you understand how badly everyone involved needed this film to matter. The title, Bite the Bullet, carries a specific historical resonance that Brooks's marketing materials treated as decoration, but that his screenplay treated as structural argument. The phrase originated in field surgery, the instruction given to a patient undergoing amputation or wound treatment without anesthetic to clench down on a bullet or piece of leather rather than scream. It was the command to endure unbearable pain without complaint because there was no alternative and no relief available. What Brooks's film is actually about, not a horse race, but a meditation on a generation of American men and women who had built their identities around a frontier that was dissolving beneath them while they were still standing on it, is contained entirely in that surgical instruction. You will endure this, you will not be rescued, you will keep moving, or you will die in the desert. The critics who received Bite the Bullet as a Western about horses missed the title's prescription. It was never about the race. It was about what the race cost and why the racers kept going anyway. Richard Brooks arrived at Bite the Bullet in 1973 as one of the most decorated writer-directors in Hollywood. 8 Academy Award nominations, 1 Oscar win for Elmer Gantry, a body of work running from Blackboard Jungle to In Cold Blood that represented the gold standard of serious American social cinema. He also arrived as a man whose last genuinely acclaimed film had been made 6 years earlier. The productions that followed In Cold Blood, the romantic melodrama The Happy Ending, the crime caper Dollar, had not extended his reputation. They had merely continued it at a lower altitude. Bite the Bullet was, in the precise language of Brooks's ambition, his attempt to write an elegy for the America he had been documenting since the 1940s. To make, as he put it, a love poem to this country and its vanishing people. Peter O'Toole had called him the man who lived at the top of his voice. And the voice that produced Bite the Bullet was a man shouting his most personal argument as loudly as he could while the culture moved past him. Toward Jaws and Star Wars and everything that followed, he could not have known that. He kept shouting anyway. What the AFI catalog records from American Cinema Editor confirm, and what represents one of the more extraordinary directorial control practices documented in 1970s Hollywood, is that no cast member of Bite the Bullet received a complete screenplay before filming began. Not Hackman, not Coburn, not Bergen, not Johnson, nobody. Brooks's established working method, applied to every production he controlled, was to withhold the full script entirely and distribute daily sides. The scenes to be filmed the following day, delivered the night before so that the actors arrived each morning knowing only what the immediate situation required and nothing beyond it. The finale of the film was not scripted at all. Film editor George Grenville confirmed in production correspondence that the race's conclusion was composed entirely from what the actors and the landscape gave Brooks on the day. The most carefully constructed narrative of Brooks's career, a story whose entire thematic architecture depends on the reader's accumulated understanding of each character's private motivation, was performed by actors who never saw the whole picture. The control Brooks exercised was total. His actors were the last people on the production to understand what they were making. Bite the Bullet was the first film publicly announced by Columbia Pictures under the new management of David Begelman and Peter Guber, the leadership team hired to rescue a studio that had spent most of the late 1960s in commercial freefall. The symbolism was deliberate. A serious, prestige Western by an Oscar-winning writer-director starring a legitimate post-French Connection star in Gene Hackman announced that the new Columbia would make films of consequence. What nobody at Columbia's new management could have known in September 1973, when they made that announcement, was that Steven Spielberg was simultaneously developing a mechanical shark story for Universal that would open on June 20, 1975, the same week Columbia had scheduled Bite the Bullet for release. Jaws earned $25,700,000 in its first 13 days. Bite the Bullet earned $5 million in its entire domestic run. Brooks's love poem to America was drowned in the first wave of the blockbuster era before a single review had time to matter. The film that was supposed to announce Columbia's serious intentions became, through no fault of its own, the demonstration of exactly what serious intentions were worth in the summer of 1975. The route by which Gene Hackman arrived in the lead role of Sam Clayton is a sequence of refusals and redirections, so comprehensively documented in production correspondence that it reads as a masterclass in how excellent casting is, frequently the result of everyone else saying no. Brooks had always wanted Hackman. By his own admission, the actor was his first and only genuine creative preference. But Hackman was contractually committed to French Connection 2 and unavailable. The studio then pursued Paul Newman, who liked the script and declined, concluding he was not appropriate for it. Burt Reynolds was enthusiastic and willing. The studio considered him insufficiently established as a star. James Caan was interested in appearing alongside Reynolds. The studio rejected that pairing. Charles Bronson was offered the lead and turned it down. The role of Luke Matthews went through Sean Connery, Donald Sutherland, and Bruce Dern, all of whom Brooks wanted and the studio rejected before James Coburn was approved, a man Brooks described as someone who was routinely better than his material. Fox then agreed to delay French Connection 2 to free Hackman. Every piece of the casting that made the film work, Hackman's physical authority, Coburn's laconic gambler energy, their specific chemistry, was the residue of 10 prior refusals. The film that exists is the film that nobody else wanted to make. Ben Johnson arrived on the New Mexico locations in April 1974 to play Mr., an aging cowboy riding the race for the simple, devastating reason that he wants, before he dies, to have done something worth remembering. He arrived as the only person on the production for whom this was not performance. Johnson had grown up on an Oklahoma ranch, roped cattle before he could read, come to Hollywood in 1940 to deliver a load of horses for Howard Hughes, and spent the following 3 decades proving that the West he had been raised in was real and the West the movies depicted was not. He had won a World Rodeo Championship in 1953, the only man in history to hold both that title and an Academy Award. He had been blacklisted by John Ford for the offense of refusing to be publicly humiliated. He had told reporters that he was prouder of his roping championship than his Oscar. When Johnson rode across the white sands of New Mexico in the summer of 1974, he was not inhabiting Mr.'s exhausted longing for one last moment of dignity. He was expressing his own. The performance that multiple reviewers identified as deserving a second Academy Award was not a performance. It was a man riding into the landscape that had shaped him, playing a version of what he feared he might become, on horses he understood better than any other person on the set. Paul Stewart, a character actor of considerable distinction whose career had run from Citizen Kane through 3 decades of supporting roles, was cast as J.B. Parker, the wealthy rancher whose sponsored thoroughbred represents the race's corrupting commercial interest. He appeared on location in New Mexico in early April 1974 and within the first 2 weeks of the 68-day shoot suffered a heart attack. He was hospitalized at Espanola Hospital and removed from the production entirely. The problem was structural. Parker was essential to the film's narrative architecture for the first quarter of the running time. Brooks's solution, documented in production reports and confirmed by film editor George Grenville, was one of the more technically ingenious pieces of post-production surgery in 1970s Hollywood. A single looped line of dialogue, never filmed, inserted purely in post-production, transformed Parker's son Jack, played by Dabney Coleman in scenes that had already been filmed, into the character's narrative successor. The looped line creates a seamless transfer of the character's function between actors in a way that most audiences have never detected. Stewart received no credit on screen and no acknowledgement in the production's publicity materials. His heart attack is a footnote in the AFI catalog record. The invisible seam his illness left in the film's structure is still there, perfectly sutured, 60 miles from the nearest hospital. Candice Bergen arrived on the Bite the Bullet locations in 1974 as a beautiful actress of acknowledged limitations, well-known, adequately competent, and openly unserious about her craft in the way that beauty and early fame sometimes permit. What happened on that New Mexico location, documented in Bergen's own later testimony in TCM production materials, was a confrontation she described as the most professionally consequential experience of her life. Hackman, watching Bergen work without the rigor the role required, said what he thought, directly, specifically, without diplomatic softening, about her technique and her commitment. Bergen requested his help. Hackman gave it. Bergen subsequently described the experience in terms that are not ambiguous. He was the first person to give her a genuine sense of respect for acting the first to show her the complexity and infinite challenge of the profession. He made bad material good and mediocre writing great, she said, and he did not care at all what anyone thought of him while doing it. The Candice Bergen who walked into the New Mexico desert as an adequate actress walked out 68 days later as a professional. Murphy Brown was 13 years away. The nomination that would follow required the education that Hackman had delivered, and that he had delivered without institutional encouragement or personal obligation, simply because the work on screen demanded it. Bite the Bullet belongs to a lineage it never publicly acknowledged, and that criticism has never adequately traced. The tradition of the endurance Western, in which the journey itself is the moral argument and the destination is almost irrelevant. The most direct ancestor is not the professionals, Brooks's own 1966 masterwork, which it superficially resembles in its ensemble structure and its desert landscape, but Raoul Walsh's The Big Trail from 1930, the panoramic wagon train epic that first established the American West as a space where the journey transforms the traveler regardless of whether the traveler survives it. Brooks absorbed this tradition through 40 years of Hollywood craftsmanship and then did something neither Walsh nor any subsequent practitioner of the endurance Western had managed. He made the transformation explicitly elegiac. His racers are not building anything. They are not going anywhere that will be better than where they started. They are riding toward the end of the world they know, and they are doing it because they are the kind of people who, when presented with an impossible endurance race across a dying landscape, climb into the saddle. That is not a Western argument. It is a specifically American argument about a specifically American kind of stubbornness, the refusal to acknowledge when the thing you were built for no longer exists. Harry Stradling Jr.'s cinematography in Bite the Bullet, praised even by the film's most hostile critics as visually exceptional, singled out by Vincent Canby as the production's sole genuine achievement, was constructed around a set of New Mexico and Nevada locations that carried their own argument before a frame was shot. White Sands National Monument, where the film's most hallucinatory sequences were filmed, is a landscape of gypsum dunes, so purely white and so spatially disorienting that the horses and riders moving across it appear to exist outside normal time. The Cumbers and Toltec Scenic Railroad, a narrow gauge line running between Chama, New Mexico, and Antonito, Colorado, the same railroad that had been photographed by Ansel Adams and used as a location for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid 6 years earlier, provided the film's temporal argument in visual form, a steam engine running parallel to horses, the future already present, the racers outpaced by an industrial infrastructure they have not noticed yet. Stradling did not need to editorialize. He simply put the horses next to the train and let the century comment on itself. The critical reception of Bite the Bullet in June 1975 was divided along a precise fault line that tells you everything about the critical moment and nothing reliable about the film. Vincent Canby in the New York Times concluded it contained not one moment that could be called genuine, a judgment that, given his simultaneous admission that the cinematography was spectacularly beautiful, requires a rather selective definition of genuineness. Roger Ebert found the film a finely crafted epic western that reaffirmed the genre's traditional power and gave it his full recommendation. The split between Canby and Ebert was not a difference of taste. It was a difference of criterion. Canby measured the film against the psychological immediacy of the new Hollywood films that had preceded it and found it too literary, too structured, too deliberately composed. Ebert measured it against the Western's own tradition and found it magnificent. Both were looking at the same film. The one who understood what Brooks was making was Ebert. The one whose review the studio's publicity quoted was Canby. The film was buried by the critic who did not understand it. On the same weekend, it was buried by a shark. The America that Bite the Bullet was elegizing in 1974, the America of individual competence, stoic endurance, and grudging dignity in the face of institutional indifference, did not vanish when Jaws opened. It continued to erode steadily and documentably through the subsequent 50 years of consolidation, financialization, and the replacement of the individual practitioner with the institutional brand. The racers in Brooks's film are not heroes. They are skilled, damaged, morally complicated people doing something extremely difficult in a landscape that is ceasing to value what they know how to do. Mr. wants to be remembered for something before he dies. Sam Clayton wants to tell the true story of San Juan Hill rather than the comfortable one. Luke Matthews has bet everything on himself and needs to be right. These are not the motivations of people living in a culture that supports them. They are the motivations of people riding as fast as they can in the direction the culture stopped caring about. 50 years later, in a landscape that has systematically replaced expertise with celebrity and endurance with content, the film reads not as a Western set in 1906, but as a documentary set in the present tense. Brooks called it a love poem to America. It turned out to be a eulogy. The film that survived is slower than its moment required and more serious than its audience could accommodate. It is also, in its seriousness, more honest than the entertaining masterpiece it might have been if the shark had not eaten it alive. Brooks spent his career fighting the gap between the America he documented and the America audiences preferred to watch. And Bite the Bullet is the production where that gap was widest, most consequential, and most precisely mapped. Hackman called it the toughest film he ever worked on. Bergen called it the production that taught her what acting was. Johnson rode across white sands on horses he had spent a lifetime understanding, playing a man running out of time, and delivered a performance that deserved the award it never received. Paul Stewart had a heart attack in the desert and was sutured invisibly into a film he barely appeared in. And Jaws opened on the same Friday, and the shark won, and Bite the Bullet sank without a trace. But here's the question that Brooks's film leaves, embedded in that final stretch of desert, in those last miles where the racers keep going, not because they can win, but because stopping is the one thing they cannot bring themselves to do. If the most honest American film of 1975 about what it cost to keep writing when the world has stopped watching, a film that earned $5 million and was reviewed as too literary by the critic who called its landscape beautiful, was destroyed not by its own failures, but by the pure calendar accident of opening on the same weekend as the first blockbuster, then how many other honest films have been buried not because they were wrong, but simply because the shark opened on the same Friday? And if the answer is dozens, maybe hundreds, what does that tell you about which films you have been permitted to see and which ones were swallowed before you had the chance? Leave that in the comments. If this investigation changed how you see Bite the Bullet, leave a like, because there are 1,000 films with buried secrets that deserve the same forensic attention, and the algorithm needs to know this kind of digging matters.